All right. Hello, my name is Dr. Brittany Bradley, and I am the postdoctoral psychology fellow at SIU's Developmental Behavioral Pediatric Clinic. Today, we will be talking a little bit about behavior management and going over some of the basic behavioral principles that we want to consider when trying to intervene or manage behaviors that may arise in some of our kiddos. All right. So these are just some general strategies for managing behaviors. So when we try to target certain behaviors or provide intervention for certain behaviors, we're looking to either increase positive behaviors or decrease unwanted behaviors. So some of the ways that we can work towards increasing more of those positive behaviors or behaviors that we want to see more of is creating more structure and routines in everyday life. We can also just kind of model and teach the behavior or skill that we want to see. Providing prompts and reminders is helpful, and also providing reinforcement or rewards for some of those behaviors that you want to reinforce or encourage. Some of the ways that we might try to decrease unwanted behaviors is providing that immediate correction or redirection. So as soon as you see that behavior happening, immediately providing that redirection or correcting that. We may also try to extinguish the behavior, making sure that there isn't like a hidden reward in that. And we may also resort to punishment or use that. We do want to try to use that more sparingly, but sometimes that is also an additional option for decreasing some of those unwanted behaviors. So these are some ways that you can reinforce some of those positive behaviors and behaviors that you want to see. So one of the ways is through just natural reinforcement, and that's just, thinking that a child learns, to ask for help because they receive help after making that request. So it's like those immediate things, it's like that cause and effect of like, I know if I do this, then this is going to happen. Or I know if I do this, then I get this in return. So it's kind of like that natural reinforcement. Another example is when you pick up your toys, you have more room to play. Another way of providing that reinforcement is through social reinforcement. And so that could be through like hugs, high fives, positive praise, smiles, one-on-one time or time with others like friends or family members. You can also provide tangible reinforcement. And so that's providing access to something that they may want. So that might be food or snacks, toys, something that's related to their interest or that they like or that is motivating for them. And when thinking about implementing some of those tangible reinforcers, it's always best to pair that with that verbal praise as well and being really specific in that praise. You can also provide activities as a way to reward behaviors that you want to see. So maybe a special trip with the family, or going to see a family member or a friend, playing a game that they like, or having some TV time and watching their favorite show or movie. You could implement a token system. And so this is used to bridge the gap between the positive behaviors happening and then earning a bigger reward later. So some of the like token systems that we may see is like a sticker chart or like a behavior chart, things like that, to where they can see that this behavior that I'm doing is working toward a larger reward at the end. And then we can also use negative reinforcement. And so that is removing something that is undesired or that may be a little more aversive. And so going back to this, when thinking about choosing reinforcers or thinking about what would be best for your child or the child that you're working with, it's good to observe the child and see like, what do they play with? What do they like? Who do they spend time with? And sometimes you can also just flat out ask the child, like, what do you like? Or what do you want to work for? Do you want to work for stickers? Do you want to work for a prize box? Do you want to work for something bigger later? And it's always important to monitor that reinforcement routinely because those preferences change over time. And so you never want it to be that you're providing that reinforcement and it's no longer motivating or reinforcing for the child. So these are just some tips and tricks to help with that reinforcement and reward. So we want to try to resort more to the reinforcement over the punishment. We want to make sure that those reinforcers and that reward is contingent on those positive behaviors that we want to see, or those target behaviors that we're targeting. Reinforcers and rewards should be immediate. So as soon as you see the behavior happening, you're providing that immediate reinforcer or that immediate reward, so that the child is able to kind of make that link of, okay, if I do this, then I get this. Rewards and reinforcers should be age appropriate. We want to make sure that we're giving those consistently. And we should be specific and clear on what the expectations are, what the reward is, if they meet those expectations, and then what consequences are if, or what the punishment is if not, or engaging in more of those inappropriate behaviors. Again, we want to make sure that we are pairing the reinforcers and the rewards with that verbal praise, to help kids connect to those natural reinforcers. And starting out when implementing some of these, reinforcers or rewards, we want to make sure that we're doing this very frequently. So at first starting out, like you might do it every time. So every time you see that behavior happening, you're providing that reward or that reinforcer. And then over time, you can fade that out. So maybe it's every other time, or maybe the first time you get it and then the third time you get it. So kind of switching it up so they're not linking of like, okay, if I do this, I get this. And they're kind of building that internal motivation. So when we think about reinforcement, these are ways to increase some of the positive behaviors that we want to see. And we can also use punishment, and both reinforcement and punishment both help to decrease the frequency of a child's negative behavior, with, again, reinforcement typically being more helpful because it does provide ideas for some of those replacement behaviors that we can help children learn. So what is reinforcement? Reinforcement is essentially a stimulus that follows and is contingent upon a behavior, and it increases the probability of that behavior being repeated. So it is increasing that behavior. So some of the ways that we can provide reinforcement, we can provide positive reinforcement, which is the presentation of a desirable stimulus in order to increase the probability of that behavior happening or being repeated. And so this can be used to really strengthen some of those newly learned skills. It's not bribing or anything like that, but it could be just verbal praise of like, good job cleaning your toys. And again, like it could be a tangible reinforcement. And with those, you want to also pair that with some of that verbal praise. An important point is that when you're giving that reinforcement, it's important to be specific. So don't just say, oh, good job. You want to make sure that you're tailoring that reinforcement accordingly by, saying like, good job cleaning your toys, or good job following directions. So being specific so that the child knows like, okay, this is the behavior that I'm getting this praise for. And then again, tailoring that reinforcement by identifying what motivates the child for those tangible reinforcers. Negative reinforcement is increasing a behavior by removing a certain stimulus or object. And then we have punishment. And so this is a stimulus used to decrease an undesirable behavior. So positive punishment might be like the introduction of an object or stimulus that will decrease the likelihood of that undesirable behavior from happening again in the future. So an example of that might be providing a verbal warning for misbehaving. You can also look into negative punishment. And so that's removing a stimulus to lower the chances of that unwanted behavior from happening again. So that could be like taking away a toy or electronics if their room is messy, or if they did not follow directions or do what you asked them to do. So this is just kind of a chart, just kind of summing all of that up. So we see that reinforcement is used to increase the likelihood of a behavior to happen, whereas punishment is typically used to decrease the likelihood of those unwanted behaviors happening. So when we think about punishment, it's really only punishment if it, again, decreases that behavior. So just kind of a quick review, when we're implementing that punishment, we're removing access to something that the child likes when that unwanted behavior happens. So you might think of things like timeout, loss of privileges, and kind of those natural consequences. And it's important to keep punishment as natural as possible. Presenting something that the child does not like when an unwanted behavior happens can also be used as a form of punishment. So that could be like providing extra chores. Sometimes parents may resort to more yelling or spanking. This happens. We try to discourage this, but if used, just, be careful, because sometimes this can further reinforce the behavior that you're not wanting to see. So when we talk a little bit more about like functions of behavior, or why individuals may engage in certain behaviors, it serves a particular function. And so sometimes the function of a kid's behavior is to get certain attention, and that can be either positive attention or negative attention. So sometimes when we resort to more of the yelling or spanking, it's reinforcing because the child is still getting that attention, even though it may be more negative. So these are just some tips when thinking about implementing timeout. So timeout should be used for more destructive behaviors. When thinking about implementing a timeout, it's important to establish a location beforehand and use this location consistently if possible. Timeout should be free from reinforcement. So children should not have access to tangibles or attention. It should just be a location where they don't have access to some of those reinforcers. And just a guide for implementing timeout, you should have a minute of timeout for each year of life. So if a child is 4 years old, a 4-minute timeout. And it's helpful to use a timer so that the child can have that visual reminder of like, okay, this is the number of minutes I have, and they can kind of see that as like that countdown. And then after completion of their timeout, parents should try to praise the first positive behavior that they see. And then when thinking about loss of privileges, this works best when children feel supported, encouraged, and safe. And so some things to consider is this is best used only occasionally. We don't want to constantly like remove access to some of those privileges. And it's useful to combine this with strategies that encourage those positive behaviors. So that positive attention, positive praise. You could link loss of privileges to family rules and involve the child in deciding on these rules and consequences. And we see that loss of privileges is best for school-age children. So school-age children are kind of at that stage where they can understand that the consequence is a result of that continued unacceptable behavior. It isn't as useful for children who are under about 5 or 6 years old because it's more difficult for them to make that connection of, okay, I did this behavior and so I'm getting this consequence. And so for children between like 3 to 6 years old, you could think about using some more of those positive behavior strategies, such as those natural consequences or timeouts. So thinking about natural consequences of misbehavior, with this, children can learn a lot from these. So natural consequences occur without like that adult interference. It's kind of like that cause and effect of like, linking actions with those consequences. So example of these might be if I leave my toys out in the rain, then the toys get wet and they get rusty. Or if I'm playing roughly with the pet, then the pet might scratch me. So it's kind of like those natural consequences and that cause and effect. Natural consequences are often effective in allowing children just to experience the natural consequences of their actions and really just learn from them. As we know, like as adults, we learn best from just kind of going through the experience ourselves. So it kind of helps children connect that as well. And so this image is just a further guide of, things to consider with natural consequences. So when children kind of, endure some of those natural consequences, try to avoid the lectures of like, I told you that would happen, or I told you so. Show them that empathy of like, this must be uncomfortable. Be comforting without like rescuing them, and, validate their feelings and have like some, just conversation about that cause and effect. So how can you deliver reinforcement? Again, research shows that reinforcing desired behaviors is often more effective in the long term than punishing more of those unwanted behaviors. It's important to, make sure that reinforcers are contingent on the behavior that you want to see happen again. And again, make sure that those reinforcers are provided immediately as soon as you observe that behavior. The quicker the reinforcement, the stronger the connection that the child will make between their action and that positive outcome. You should also, again, make sure that reinforcers are age appropriate, they're specific, they're clear, they're sincere, and be consistent with providing those reinforcers. So if reinforcements are applied inconsistently, then it becomes more difficult for children to understand that link between their behavior and that outcome. And then again, it's always good to pair those reinforcers with verbal praise. And again, being very specific with that praise. And so with this, set clear expectations so that children can really just understand what's expected of them. All right. So when thinking about whether to use reinforcement over punishment, it's always good to focus on that positive reinforcement first. So focusing on those positive behaviors, using those reinforcement strategies previously discussed. And this really involves like teaching and strengthening some of those replacement skills. So teaching some of those alternative behaviors that serve the same function, but are safer. Also, just, thinking about focusing on those positive reinforcers or that positive reinforcement, it really just overall creates a supportive environment where children are more motivated to adopt some of those new behaviors. And it's overall just a more positive learning experience for our kiddos. When thinking about teaching some of those replacement skills, this is really key because it provides the individual and the child with appropriate ways to meet the needs. So it's not just, providing the reinforcement or reinforcer or things like that, but also teaching those skills to still get that, attention that they want or get access to what they're wanting, but in safer and more appropriate ways. Follows fails, and you've tried all of the reinforcement strategies, they're not working, you've exhausted that list, then you could consider using more of the punishment approach, and just, considering introducing a consequence to decrease that behavior if that reinforcement is ineffective. Again, when thinking about punishment, try to implement this after thoroughly just exploring and implementing the reinforcement techniques. And when used, the focus should be on the least intrusive method. So again, removing those privileges rather than some of those more harsher consequences. So now we'll talk a little bit about functions of behavior that I was alluding to a little bit earlier. So when we think about behavior, behavior is functional. It's serving a certain purpose. The behavior just, it pays off for the child in some way and they want to do it again. And so when we want to think about like the function of behavior, we want to understand like the why, like why is my child engaging in this? And so understanding why a child is engaging in a behavior helps us better learn how to react to that behavior and how to teach some of those replacement behaviors. So when we think about the 4 functions of behavior, we could use that acronym of SEE. We're going to take a C. So the 4 functions of behavior, that S stands for sensory stimulation. So it's something that's like stimulating for the child in some way. They want to feel something. It feels good. It meets those sensory needs. So some examples of that could be like rocking front to back, clapping fingers in front of eyes, running around, those types of things. The second function is escape or avoidance. So kids might say, I want to get out of something. This is not something that I like or something that feels good. So they may want to escape or avoid a certain task, a person, an environment, anything that seems aversive to them. And so with this, an example might be a child throwing a tantrum to get out of an activity, or like if they're playing with toys and you ask them to clean up, they're throwing a tantrum to get out of that cleaning. So questions to kind of ask yourself when thinking about this is, does my child engage in a problem behavior after I've given an instruction? Is my child trying to avoid doing something? And this can help you kind of tease out whether it's that escape or avoidance. The third function is attention. So, they may want to be noticed for something. They may want to get some positive praise. This could be attention from adults, from peers, and again, this attention could be positive or negative. So, for example, a kiddo might hit a sibling to get their parents' attention. So some questions that you could ask yourself is my child engaging in a behavior only when others are present? Does my child check to see if others are watching them, engage in this undesired behavior? So those are some things that you can kind of consider when trying to tease that out. And then the last function, the fourth, is tangible. So that's to get access to something that they want. So that could be something like edible, like food or drink. It could also be like toys or a game. And so an example of this might be a kiddo throwing a tantrum in the store to get a parent to buy something that they want. So some things to consider and questions to ask when trying to see like if the function that's kind of serving that behavior is more tangible, is my child wanting something? Is my child engaged in this behavior when an activity has ended? So those types of things. When trying to determine the function of a child's behavior, we want to think about the ABCs of behavior. So that A stands for antecedent. What's occurring right before the behavior is happening? The B is the behavior. So that's the problem behavior, the target behavior that you're trying to intervene on. And then the C stands for consequence. So what's happening right after the behavior? And so overall, just the ABCs of behavior really help us to understand why the behavior is occurring and really determine the particular function of that behavior. And it really just kind of helps us identify certain triggers, patterns to behavior, just to better understand that function. And typically what we'll see if we collect data on this, so oftentimes I'll have like a little chart where there's 3 different columns for the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. And when you're collecting that data and you're tracking that behavior, you can kind of see like, okay, this, maybe the child's behaving in more tantrums or outbursts when I give them a command or tell them that they have to do an activity. So they're trying to escape that. And so you can kind of look at that to determine certain trends and patterns. So this is an example of what the ABCs of behavior looks like. So as an example, you tell your child to clean up, they start screaming, crying, You try to soothe them by picking them up, and then you end up cleaning up the toys yourself. So we see that the antecedent of the behavior, what set that behavior off, was you telling your child to clean up, or they were presented with a demand. The behavior that the child engaged in was the crying, screaming, and as a result, what happened after was that they received that attention, they were able to escape that demand, and they didn't have to clean up. And so you can kind of see, like, oftentimes also we'll see like that a behavior might serve multiple functions, so that you can see with this example, the child is, the function of the child's behavior is getting that attention from parent, and they're also escaping a demand that they did not want to do. So when thinking about replacement behaviors, depending on that particular function, sensory is typically the most difficult because that behavior is automatically reinforced. So in this case, it's helpful to provide a functionally equivalent replacement behavior. So for example, like if a child bangs their head on their hands, or if they're engaging in head banging on other objects, to provide like that pressure, you might block that object from hitting their head by having them wear like a snug cap, or providing like a pillow, something like that, where they can do it in a safer way. For kids seeking that sensory input, implement predictable sensory routines, including some of those specific activities or objects that meet that sensory need, to try to avoid kind of like that preventative approach to try to avoid that behavior happening. If you're trying to find some replacement behaviors for escape, you could teach kids to ask for breaks or regular access to those preferred activities, tasks, persons, or spaces. So the idea is that if the child has regular access to breaks, then they won't have to misbehave to get out of doing something or to get access to a break. For attention, you could try teaching appropriate ways to ask for attention. So a lot of times, sometimes kids know appropriate ways to ask, but they want that attention faster. So to get around this, you could provide just a lot of attention immediately after they request attention appropriately. Another option is just ignoring some of those more inappropriate behaviors. And so make it so appropriate requests gets them attention better than the problem behavior. Because sometimes, like if they're engaging in that problem behavior and you respond or react, again, that's further reinforcing and they're still getting that attention. So engaging in some of that planned ignoring. You could also try to provide that non-contingent attention whenever possible, so that they're getting that frequent access to attention without engaging in those more inappropriate behaviors. For tangible, you could teach appropriate ways to access some of those tangibles. So make it so that asking appropriately gets them tangibles faster than engaging in those inappropriate behaviors. And so we can see that a lot of the replacement behavior involves teaching. And so we can teach some of these skills and some of these more appropriate behaviors through that explicit instruction. We can model for kids and show them more appropriate ways. We can provide practice opportunities. Sometimes it might be like with siblings, or like when you're out in the community, in school settings, like that could be in like small groups or social skills groups where they can try to get like some of that peer attention in more appropriate ways. So opportunities like that where they can just practice and receive that feedback. You can also teach some of these replacement behaviors through reinforcement, like we previously discussed, and then just getting ongoing support from, others in the child's life that can also provide some additional insight. So this is just breaking down each function, like what it looks like, and then things that you can try, just kind of based on that particular function. So again, for more of those attention-seeking behaviors, trying to engage in some of that planned ignoring, making sure that you're not giving attention for some of those problem behaviors to further reinforce those from happening. Giving lots of praise and attention for the behaviors that you do want to see so that they're getting that attention for more of those appropriate behaviors and making that link. And again, teaching some of those skills and practicing more appropriate ways for your child to get your attention. So that might be like making eye contact, using words, using gestures, tapping you on the shoulder, those types of things. You can really individualize this to the child's level of understanding, their ability to show them more appropriate ways. For escape, it's important to make sure that you're following through with your demand, even though your child may engage in that problem behavior. You may need to reduce your demand initially to like gain that compliance. So for example, if you want your child to clean up all her toys, child may start to yell. You could reduce your demand by telling her that, okay, let's just clean up one toy and then we can have a break. You could also like just completely come over and have the tub and give her the toy in her hand. Okay, let's put this toy in the bucket and give that positive praise like, oh my goodness, great job cleaning up. So you're like reinforcing and teaching that, you know, when you listen, when you try and you comply, you get that get that praise and that reinforcement. A quick tip, ensure that if you do come back to the task later, you still follow through and have the child clean up all the toys so that they don't learn that, oh, if I, you know, engage in this behavior, I can just escape the task completely. So again, making sure that you're following through with that demand completely. We talked about giving lots of praise when the child complies, even if it's something very small. You can teach and practice a more appropriate way for your child to request a break. Again, so just kind of showing them how to use their word, requesting break, bringing you a picture card that has the word break on it. So some of those things where they can kind of get access to that break without engaging in some of those behaviors. And then also visual supports can be really helpful. So things like a first then chart where you can show like, okay, it's like two column. First, we have a picture of cleaning up. Then we get access to TV time or, you know, whatever that reward is. So some of those visual aids, visual schedules, social stories can be helpful to kind of teach some of those more replacement behaviors. For tangible, it's important to not give the child the item that they want when they're engaging in that problem behavior, to try to avoid reinforcing that behavior. So you could teach and practice a more appropriate way for your child to ask for the item. So gesturing, pointing, giving a picture card, whatever, you know, that child's level of understanding and their ability is. Again, giving the child lots of praise and reinforcement, and giving them the item that they want when they ask appropriately. And then sometimes it's helpful to offer choices. So if the child can't have the item that they're wanting, you could give them other options which they can have. So if they want cookies, you can say, oh, we can have a cracker or we can have a strawberry, which one? And so it's still not giving them that access, but it's kind of allowing them to have some sense of control or autonomy in making their own choice instead of like forcing them to, you know, not have it or to do something else. And again, visual aids can be helpful for this as well, thinking about those first then charts, visual schedules, and social stories. And then for that sensory behavior, again, a lot of times this is the hardest because it's providing that immediate, you know, input for the child. So sometimes it may be more helpful to seek more medical advice to rule out any medical problems. If there isn't any like medical concerns going on, you could redirect those inappropriate behaviors. So trying to engage your child in something that provides that same sensory input, but it's more appropriate. So going back to like that head banging example, like instead of banging their head on the floor, like we can, you know, use this soft squishy or pillow or, you know, things like that to where they're still getting that input, but it's not harmful for them. It's a little. The example that they provided is child playing with spit. So you can provide opportunities where they can play with something that has that same sensation, but it's more appropriate. So water play, gel, foam, slime, those types of things. Um, Reward and give lots of praise to your child when they're not engaging in that problem behavior. And then again, teach those more appropriate ways or socially acceptable ways and places to engage in those behaviors. So now we'll talk a little bit about selecting target behaviors, as this is a crucial step in setting the path for, that intervention and finding ways to intervene and, correct some of those more undesirable or problem or inappropriate behaviors. So target behavior is the behavior that has been selected for change. These are significant because, again, it gives direction and focus to how we intervene, how we respond. Target behaviors can range from improving social skills to reducing self-harming actions. It really just depends on the individual's unique need. So when thinking about choosing a target behavior, the first step is to operationally define the behavior. So the behavior should be defined in a way that's easily observable and measurable. So for example, instead of saying, we're going to target being disruptive, we'll say we're going to target shouting during class when we're transitioning, like being very specific. So we want to think, will the stranger know what to look for based on that definition of alone? So if somebody's coming in to watch your child and you're like, we're working on, being disruptive, like that might be a little bit vague for them and they might not know what that looks like. So you could let them know we're working on, not yelling back when they're presented with, a task. So being really specific. Step 2 is to observe the behavior. So again, thinking about those ABCs, and you can track that using like a paper log. You could track it in your phone, but just kind of keeping a record of what the behavior is, what was happening right before, and what was happening after, so we can try to determine the function of that behavior and how best to intervene, or if there's any particular patterns that we're noticing. Sometimes when observing behavior, it's also helpful to just kind of make note of like the setting, the time of day, who was around, to see like, okay, is the behavior happening more in the morning versus the evening? Is it happening with, particular people, to see like if maybe it's like an environmental or setting thing as well. And then we also want to make sure that we're measuring and we're monitoring progress. So this really helps to assess the effectiveness of, what we're putting in place. So if you're reinforcing, providing those reinforcers, to increase some of those more positive behaviors, then we want to see like, okay, how often is this working? Is it working at all? So measuring and monitoring the progress of that kind of helps us determine like if it's helpful or if we need to switch something up and maybe add something else to target some of those behaviors. So to measure some of this progress, you could think about frequency count. So how often is the child engaging in this behavior? You can think about duration. This is typically helpful for like more tantrum behavior. So like at first they were engaging in tantrums for 40 minutes and now it's only 10 minutes. So, even though they're still engaging in these tantrums, it's not as long as it was previously. So we can see that it's helping in some kind of way. Or you think about latency, the length of time between, instructions to perform and the occurrence of the behavior. So these kind of help us to, again, track that data over time and see if we need to make any adjustments to how we're responding to that behavior. Some criteria for selecting a target behavior. We want to think about the relevance to a person's life. Target behaviors should not be selected for the benefit of others, but for the benefit of the child. We want to think about the potential harm to the individual or others. The ability for the behavior to be changed through intervention, and then is the behavior to be increased or decreased. And again, that helps to inform just that treatment and reinforcement over punishment. So when thinking about just kind of intervening, responding to some of these challenging behaviors that we might see, we want to consider how, this idea of social learning. And social learning really considers how children may observe and imitate what they see. So it's really important for caregivers to, regulate their own emotions when responding to behavior. Sometimes it's hard because it's overwhelming. It's like there's these really big behaviors going on. I have no idea what to do. I'm feeling overwhelmed and overstimulated, and it kind of shows on our face or how we respond. And the child is observing this, and often we see that they start to imitate some of these behaviors. And so they might imitate if you're responding positively in a calm way, you're being patient with them, you're, reminding them of expectations, redirecting appropriately, they start imitating more of these positive behaviors. Where on the flip side, if you're yelling, responding in ways that, might further reinforce or might be more negative, they might mirror that. And so when they're responding, it's in the same way. They're yelling and lashing out and those types of things. So it's important to think about how, our children watch what we do. They're modeling us, they're imitating us. And so when we're responding to some of these behaviors, we might need to just kind of take a minute, take a couple breaths, and then, redirect and respond. So that way the child is seeing those positive behaviors and imitating of those positive behaviors. So now we will open up the floor for questions. Any? So we will go ahead and wrap up. Thank you all for attending and listening today. And good luck trying and implementing some of these practices.